I finished watching The Hole in the Ground about an hour ago, but instead of going to bed like a normal person, I have decided to film this video in the forest behind my house. It's been raining where I live for 51 consecutive days. Google it if you don't believe me, and it would appear it has finally stopped. And so, I figured I would come out here to ponder how this movie scared critics into an 83% while simultaneously scaring regular audience members like you and I into a seemingly disgruntled 48%. The longer I'm out here, the more I'm starting to think maybe this is less to do with quality and more to do with something nuanced. Like something Irish. I am not here to blindly defend The Hole in the Ground on behalf of my Irish heritage, but I do believe this movie casts certain shadows that you might not recognize unless you've grown up around them. So, I'm going to take you through why this movie leaves some of us so unsettled, and I'm going to explain the real reason an ancient myth about fairies stealing children still has the power to inspire so many movies. In other words, tonight, under these darling Irish skies, you and I are going to decode the fear hiding deep down inside this big, dark, moist hole. You knew I was going to make a joke about it. That wasn't that bad, and now it's out of the way. So fuck. If you want to understand why this movie hits half the audience the way it does, myself included, you have to understand the two very different things writer-director Lee Cronin buried in the dirt of this movie's foundation. The first of those things is a very unfortunate sinkhole. In 2013, a Florida man named Jeff Bush was sleeping in his bed when the earth opened up and devoured him. His brother tried digging him out, but the ground kept collapsing and Jeff was never found. Fuck. Lee Cronin heard that on the news and thought, that's the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a stray bullet from a drive-by shooting. The earth literally swallowed him whole. And the second concept you need to understand is the changeling. Not the greatest ever haunted house story with George C. Scott and Trish Van Devere that I'll be reviewing very soon. In Irish folklore, the fairies, or the Ishi, weren't whimsical Julia Roberts type creatures. They were dangerous and they were unethical. And one of their most feared practices was swapping a healthy human baby with one of their own sickly or deformed creatures that looked like the child it replaced. The mothers would watch as their infants transformed right before their eyes into something unrecognizable in their temperament or in their eating patterns or in their behavior in general. Now, on its surface, this sounds like typical folklore from any other culture, but like most folklore, it is usually born from some kind of necessity. And unfortunately, this specific Irish folklore serves a terrible purpose, psychologically speaking. They were a way for exhausted, grief-stricken mothers to cope with a reality too painful to bear, that their child had a developmental disorder or a physical illness or just wasn't thriving. For some mothers, that's not my child is easier to process than my child is suffering and I don't have the means to help them. The changeling myth gave mothers permission to distance themselves from a reality that was destroying them. And that is the ancient Irish wound Lee Cronin is exploring in this movie. Essentially, Cronin combined a modern tragedy with an ancient myth and the eerie Irish landscape, and he asked a question that burrows into your brain. What if the person you should feel the safest with, your child, and the place you should feel safest, your home, became the sources of your terror? Firstly, let's get specific about why the changeling concept can be so much more disturbing than what we're used to with regular horror. Psychologists call it the uncanny valley, and if you're a horror fan, you have heard the term 10 too many times. It's that feeling of revulsion when something looks almost right but isn't quite right. Like a realistic doll, or the corpse of a loved one. Our brains are hardwired to pick up on the slightest deviations in the familiar because for our ancestors, that slight deviation could mean your life. For instance, that guy you believed was your fellow tribe member all these years, your hunting buddy. Turns out he's not. He's actually a grizzly bear. Run away! Probably not the best example.
The Hole in the Ground weaponizes this instinct. Watch Chris's face in the talent show scene. He delivers his lines perfectly. He is charming and the audience loves him. But Shauna Kerslake, playing his mother Sarah, gives us a reaction that conveys how she's really feeling. And then there's the bedroom scene. They establish Chris is terrified of spiders early in the film. It's a small detail, but it denotes an aspect of his identity. This isn't just strange behavior from Sarah's son, it's a violation of who he is.
When Sarah sees him calmly catching and eating the spider in his bedroom, our brains scream out, That's not my hunting buddy, it's a grizzly bear. You know what I mean?
The person she knew is gone, and something is wearing his skin. This taps into another psychological terror. We want to believe a mother's bond is unbreakable, that she would know her child anywhere. But Sarah doesn't know. She suspects, and she fights, and she nearly dies trying to save him, but she never knows for certain.
And in real life, whether we choose to admit it or not, even to ourselves, sometimes we don't either. And that exact uncertainty is kind of the point here. The film is forcing us to ask ourselves, if I can't truly recognize my loved ones, do I actually love them? And here is where the film gets really dark. These are the shadows I suggested you might not recognize. The changeling myth has nothing to do with fairies. Irish people know that. Lee Cronin knows that as an Irish person. It's actually about motherhood.
Sarah is a single mother fleeing an ambiguously troubled past. We never learn exactly what happened with Chris's father, but we feel the weight of it. She's fragile when we meet her. She's already questioning herself, and when Chris starts changing, her terror isn't just about him. It's equally about herself. Is she losing her mind? Is the trauma of her past making her paranoid? Is she becoming like Noreen, the old crazy woman in the village who believed her son was a changeling and allegedly killed him?
And here is the psychological filmmaking masterstroke. The film never confirms if the creature exists or not. We are given the perfect amount of supporting evidence for both sides in equal measure. And in terms of writing, that takes a very delicate hand because you're not just crafting a screenplay, you're conveying something very real and very painful for a lot of mothers.
The sinkhole exists, and Sarah believes the creature exists in the woods. But Sarah is isolated and traumatized and sleep-deprived and under some immense stress. Every single symptom she experiences could be explained by the shaky mental state of a delicate mother in pain.
And so we are trapped with her in that uncertainty. And that's where a lot of the horror in this film really settles in and festers.
Think about this young single mother's dilemma. If the folklore is not real, it means Sarah's mind is broken by trauma. She's convinced herself her beloved child is a monster and she's capable of violence against him based on a delusion. And if the folklore was real, it means the world contains forces that can steal your child's face and replace them with a copy, and leave you alone with something that looks like your baby but is not your baby.
And there is nothing you can do about it.
When you start pondering which of these outcomes is worse, Lee Cronin turns his back on you and refuses to answer. That refusal grounds the movie in reality because the fear a mother feels when their own child starts to change or become unrecognizable to her doesn't come with a diagnosis. It just is. It's the horror of watching someone you love slip away and not knowing if they're breaking or you're breaking.
Now let's examine how Lee Cronin makes us feel all of these things without ever announcing them with stupid pandering dialogue. Your typical viewer probably wouldn't pick this up because your typical viewer has a life. However, as somebody that does their own sound design for these YouTube videos, which are usually subtle and appropriate, I picked this up during my first viewing because I'm cool.
The film opens with this single haunting piano note. Whether you're into music or not, your subconscious will hear this and it will feel incomplete and unresolved. At the very end of the movie, the same note comes back, except it's copied itself.
It's as if the note's been hiding in the forest this whole time and it's come back as its own double. And that is this movie's entire theme distilled into sound. Your brain will hear those two notes as unbalanced bookends before you consciously understand them. Probably.
The sound design continues throughout the film. In an interview, Cronin said they tried to pull horror out of domestic circumstance, in the creak of an overhead floorboard, or in the silence behind a closed door, the wrong sound of familiar footsteps. Contrary to what Hollywood espouses, horror doesn't need a scream. It just needs the ordinary to be made slightly wrong until it is unbearably wrong.
There are mirrors everywhere in this movie. And in movies, a mirror can be used to explore a character's inner psyche or to symbolize a duality within them. Or in this case, they can be used to represent the fractured identity of a damaged mother.
The opening scene portrays a warped reality which foreshadows the theme of warped perception and the loss of sanity. During the funeral scene, every mirror in the house is covered to allow the soul of the deceased to travel safely to the next world, as is customary in Irish culture.
The fairies can't maintain their human disguise when they're viewed in a reflection, so Sarah constantly checks her own reflection in the mirror to make sure she is still she.
The final scene's ambiguity conveys a very realistic potential outcome for Sarah after these events. Chris's face is blurred in the photos she takes in the closing moments. And the final shot features an entire room full of mirrors in their new home, suggesting the entire house is likely the same.
So in a supernatural sense, Sarah's not sure if she's rescued her own son or brought something awful back into her new home with her. And in the psychological sense, real-world sense, the mirrors symbolize the reality. A mother wouldn't just get over something so traumatic with her child overnight. Things like trust don't return overnight. Healing doesn't occur overnight. And so the new home full of mirrors demonstrates Sarah is still very much in protective mode, self-protective mode.
All of these details place the hole in the ground in a very specific tradition. You can feel the Babadook, a mother alone with a child who terrifies her, with the monster being her own grief. You can feel Goodnight Mommy, with the imposter child premise pushed to its breaking point. And finally, you can feel Hereditary, with trauma inherited and passed down and never completely escaped. But Lee Cronin does something distinct with his first ever feature-length film. He refuses you a sense of closure. At the end of the Babadook, there's a kind of realistic peace established in learning to live with the monster, her grief. At the end of Hereditary, there is a terrible resolution that I absolutely fucking loved. And at the end of The Hole in the Ground, there's just a photograph of Chris with a blurred face, because Sarah will never really know. She will never fully get over this, and neither will we.
So, if you're wondering why The Hole in the Ground left me so unsettled personally, I think it's because it addresses a fear most of us wouldn't admit we've ever had, and it makes it feel ancient and immediately personal and current at the same time.
The changeling myth gave our ancestors language for the unspeakable, and watching a child change and not knowing why. Lee Cronin gives us language for something just as unspeakable, with watching someone you love become a stranger, and not knowing if it's them or if it's you.
I think that's the power of horror done properly. It doesn't just make you jump, it makes you wonder. It plants questions in your head that grow out here in the dark. I'm Jonny Recaps, decoding horror one movie at a time.